High dynamic range imaging, or HDR, has become quite popular recently. In this lesson, I'll show you how you can create an HDR image using several exposures you're managing in Lightroom. While Lightroom doesn't allow you to actually assemble HDR images, it can automate the process of sending your images to Photoshop, where you can merge them into a final result you can then continue to manage in Lightroom. Here I have a series of 6 images that Mikkel captured. They represent a pretty typical situation. In this particular exposure, for example, the overall room looks pretty good, but the windows are pretty much completely blown out, as is the sunlight that's hitting the carpet and other areas of the room. If you take a look at one of the darker exposures, here you can see that the detail has been retained in the carpet and other areas of the image. With HDR, we can blend these images to produce a final image that contains maximum detail. To get started, I'll click on the first image and shift-click on the last image to select all of the images in the series that I want to blend into an HDR image. I'll then choose Photo, Edit In from the menu, and choose the option to merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. When I choose this option, if Photoshop is not already running, it will be launched. Keep in mind that the process of blending these images in Photoshop can take a little bit of time, especially with high-resolution images. But when that process is complete, the HDR Pro dialog will appear, allowing you to fine-tune the settings for the HDR capture that you're blending together. In order to ensure you're able to read all of the text in this dialog, I'm running at a resolution that doesn't allow the entire dialog to be seen at once. So I'll move this dialog up initially so that we can see that there are indeed thumbnails at the bottom of the dialog, allowing us to choose which images are included as part of this HDR, and also, of course, showing us which images are here. If we turn off any of these exposures, we can reblend the HDR to exclude that information. Obviously, if you take away too many of these exposures or take away the wrong ones, you could end up with a less than ideal result. In this case, I'll of course leave all of the exposures enabled. I'll now move the dialog down so that we can see the entirety of the preview image that HDR is putting together for us. The particular settings that you use for HDR are highly subjective. Everyone seems to have a different idea of what a final HDR image should look like, and in fact, you'll likely want different interpretations for different subjects. If you're new to HDR, I highly encourage you to play around with the presets that are available at the top right of the HDR Pro dialog. These actually provide some rather extreme variations on what's possible. The flat option, as you can see, produces a very flat and almost ethereal look to the image. We also have some more dramatic results. We can even produce a monochromatic interpretation of the image if we'd like. As you can see, we've retained lots of detail, but then in this case, contrast has been enhanced significantly. If you're trying to maintain a relatively realistic appearance, you might want to take a look at photorealistic as your starting point. Or, if you prefer something of an artificial, almost cartoonish look, you might choose one of the surrealistic options. For example, surrealistic high contrast not only creates an image that does indeed look surreal, but also has considerable contrast. Just because this is a more dramatic result, I'll go ahead and use this as my starting point. I can also fine-tune a number of settings. We could convert the final result to 8-bit mode, but that is not something I would want to do with an HDR image. In fact, I'd really rather not work with any image that's not 16 bits per channel. With HDR, we also have the option to work in 32-bit, but there are very few adjustments we can apply to a 32-bit image in Photoshop, so in this case I'll just stick with the 16-bit option. I can then choose how I want the image processed: local adaptation, equalizing the histogram, adjusting exposure and gamma, or compressing the highlights. In this case, I'll leave the option set to local adaptation, and we can explore some of the settings that are available to fine-tune our result. The edge glow settings are causing the halos that you see throughout the image. We can adjust the size of those halos with radius, and of course the strength adjusts the intensity of those halos. In this case, while the halos are certainly strong, I actually think it adds to the image, so I'll leave the options set as they are there. In the tone and detail section, there are a number of controls related to the overall tonality. Gamma adjusts the mid-tone contrast in the image. Exposure, as the name implies, adjusts exposure with an emphasis on the white point. The detail can be thought of as sharpening the image, essentially, pulling out more detail and enhancing that detail with contrast. We also have adjustments for the shadow and highlight areas of the image. In effect, these allow us to adjust the relative brightness or darkness of the shadow areas of the image or the highlight areas of the image. We can also fine-tune the color for the image. Vibrance allows us to increase saturation, but in a way that focuses on the muted colors so we don't create artificial appearance, although in this case, obviously, we've sort of given up on not having an artificial appearance for the image. Saturation is similar, except that it affects all colors in a relatively even way. We can also fine-tune the curve. I'll move the dialog up so that you can see the entirety of the curve control. Note that in this case, the curve is rather dramatic, and that's what's creating the very high contrast in our midtones, as you can see in the preview image. You can fine-tune the curve to your liking by adjusting the anchor points. Once you're happy with the HDR image you've produced, simply click OK and the final processing will be conducted. As you can see, the final image is now present in Photoshop, just the way I saw it in the preview in HDR Pro. To get this image back into Lightroom so that it can be managed there, I'll simply choose File, Save from the menu, and then File, Close. I can then switch back to Lightroom, and as you can see, the HDR image that I created in Photoshop has been added onto my film strip. I can now continue to apply adjustments in Lightroom and manage this image along with all of the other images. At this point, of course, I might want to put all of these images into a stack, so with the final result selected, I'll hold the Shift key and click on the first image, and then I'm going to right-click and choose Stacking, Group into Stack. As you can see, Lightroom makes it easy to send multiple exposures to Photoshop for the purpose of creating an HDR image. You can then continue to work with the resulting HDR image in Lightroom.